In order to make your learning independent, I decided that this broadcasting will be based on a Prezi where all learning as a topic will be discussed in small lesson length components. So let's start this experience by discussing what SAYS asks us to learn on the learning topic. So we have to learn about classical conditioning, what is classical conditioning, about operant conditioning, what it is and when it applies. We have to discuss the importance of timing in both classical and operant conditioning as part of learning. Since classical and operant conditioning are related to stimuli, we need to discuss and learn what is stimulus generalization, stimulus discrimination, and stimulus extinction. We also need to learn about another kind of learning, the observational learning, and the factors that influence learning through observation. Make a note here, observational learning is called also vicarious learning. You learn like the vicar. Also, in this topic, SAYS requests us to learn all the psychological principles that concern learning in everyday life as part of our experiences, events we confront every day, and we're going to discuss all the psychological interventions a person can be taught to cope in everyday life and find things that he has learned, not wanted things that he has learned, like phobias. So we're going to discuss behavior modification and systematic sensitization of phobias. They're two different things. Behavior modification is a kind of learning where we learn to change our behavior according to what the other people want us to do. And systematic desensitization means that we stop being sensitive on something that we have learned wrong, and this happens with a specific system, specific method, gradually it means. Now, also we have to be able to apply these psychological principles to social issues in everyday life as part of the social level of our existence and as part of our personal level of existence, so the social and the personal level of explanation. What is that meaning? It means that sometimes you learn something as a person, but your society is not allowing you to use it, or vice versa. Society is asking you to do something and your personal experience don't allow it. So society asks you to be, let's say, chatty and talkative, but you as a person are shy. This learning that happens in the social environment is not comply with the learning at the personal level, your thoughts. So that could be contradicting. Can we apply some other learning, behavior modification, to change this? We are going to discuss kind of things related to this. Also, we're going to discuss investigation designs, the methods of assessing psychological responses that have been used when people start studying learning. So, famous experiments that they used, and we're going to discuss ethical issues associated with these experiments. Many of you are aware of experiments like the little Albert. You have done it last year. So that was a study of learning. A psychologist learned how a child learns fear, but that was unethical because you cannot induce fear to a child. Okay, let's see what we're going to discuss. We said classical conditioning, that's one part of learning. We said operant conditioning we're going to discuss, and finally the observational learning, and of course all these research and ethics related items. I hope you understand what we need to learn and what has been explained to you here. Let's start with classical conditioning. But before, we need to understand this basic information. And this basic information is telling us that our future behavior is influenced by events that followed our past behavior. This is the basic characteristic of learning. So the events of my life that followed my yesterday's behavior will make me to act and behave a specific way. For example, past behavior. On Tuesday, you came late to Miss Holeva's class. Event that followed that, past behavior, was that you were sent to focus room because you came late. You were punished. So the future behavior, how you're going to act next Tuesday, is depending on the events that followed your past behavior. Because your past behavior being late was punished by sent to the focus room, your future behavior most likely will be not to be late again in my class. And that's how I can modify your behavior. Also, we need to remember something else. Our future behavior is influenced by the observation of the behavior of the others that happened in the past and the present. So past and present observations of the behavior of the others. So you're in the class that Tuesday, you're not late, but you saw Marika coming late. And because Marika came late, the past or present observation you have on Marika is that this Marika's behavior of being late was followed by a punishment. She was sent to focus room. So now your future behavior is this. You know that Miss Holeva will send you to focus room if you're late. Therefore, your future behavior will be to comply with the class rules and you won't be late. Because the behavior of others, the behavior of Marika, and your observation on her behavior taught you a valuable lesson. The last thing I want you to remember is that some associations for some people are easier to learn and maintain in our mind than others. For example, George made that connection. Late equals focus room. And he has learned that easier. Marika, though, hasn't made that association. First day, she was late. Second day, she was late, and she was sent again to the focus room. So this association was possible for her. She had to learn it the hard way, as we say. I want you to remember, though, the saying, some associations are easier to learn and maintain than others. Now we have started the basic ones. Let's discuss something also very important. We have learned in the past that some neurotransmitters are teaching us stuff. For example, when I have endorphin or noradrenaline in my blood, I'm feeling like panicking. I learn that I have to be alerted and ready to go. So sometimes, and most often to the animals and the other mammals, one of them is human, learning is part of biological process. Let's watch this video and understand what we're
This is
talking
your
about.
brain. Here are the neurons that produce dopamine. When these neurons are activated, they release dopamine here in the frontal lobes. Dopamine is motivation. When dopamine is released, you feel motivated to keep on doing whatever it is you're doing. Dopamine is what makes things seem important and meaningful. Your frontal lobes are where thoughts are formed. If your frontal lobes are low on dopamine, you get bored and start looking for something that can stimulate your dopamine neurons to release more dopamine into your frontal lobes. Food, drink, sex, social pleasure, and addictive drugs activate dopamine neurons directly. That's why they can be so addictive. Interesting sights and sounds can also activate dopamine neurons. That's why you're still watching this video. The frontal lobes themselves can form a positive feedback loop with the dopamine neurons. This is called thinking. Very few people can form feedback loops like that without thinking. That's called meditation, and it's really difficult. But most people need to think about something interesting, something they're doing or looking at, or something that's happened to them in their lives, plans and hopes they have for the future. That's why we never stop thinking. Our frontal lobes are drawn to whatever thought releases most dopamine. That's also how long-term thinking and self-discipline works. We use our frontal lobes to activate our dopamine neurons even when what we're doing is boring or difficult. People vary in how well their frontal lobes can activate their dopamine neurons. People with attention deficit disorder or addiction have great problems with it, and most of us find it difficult to go for a salad and supply our own dopamine rather than having a burger or a cake, which activate dopamine neurons directly. Personally, I think we all struggle with how to activate our dopamine neurons. What we do doesn't seem very meaningful, and the few things that really motivate us are short-sighted things that don't involve our frontal lobes much and that get us into trouble in the long run. If only there was a different way.
So, to revise what we said, I'm asking you this question. Do we learn as all the other animals? Are we learning with the frontal lobe? Are we learning because of the neurotransmitters? Actually, all this research based on learning started with animals. Be rats, pigeons, dogs. The first learning happened with them, and then we apply that to humans. So let's start our lesson, and we'll finish the classical conditioning the next 10 minutes or so. Classical conditioning. It's called classical because it's the first that was discovered by Pavlov. I'm sorry, I'm going back again. Classical conditioning. Pavlov, Thorndike and Skinner, some of the researchers who practiced and experimented with dogs, cats, rats and pigeons. And if really matters to you, all the scientists and psychologists believe that we do learn as any other. Classical conditioning is the process of forming associations between two stimuli that are normally unrelated, making connection with sound and my seatbelt, it's not logical. Nevertheless, when I hear the beeping sound in my car, because it's a specific pitch, I remember that I haven't put my seatbelt. Ivan Pavlov is a scientist who first identified classical conditioning as the association between two initially unrelated stimuli. Who is Ivan Pavlov? In 1800s, late 1800s, 1870s, Ivan Pavlov was investigating the digestive system of mammals, and the cheapest mammal he was able to find in Russia at the time was dogs. So he was experimenting on the digestion of dogs. And accidentally, he discovered and proved with a lot of experiments for first time that learned behavior in animals is due to something he called classical conditioning. He was born in 1849 and he was a son of a priest. He was ready to become a priest and he was prepared all his life to become. But he did the opposite of what his father wanted. He started studying science. In the Russia of 1800s, scientists were devil's children. His decision to start working in science had a great impact. And he was a very, very, very good physiologist. He studied the mechanisms underlying the digestive system in mammals. For his original work in this research, in the mechanisms of the digestive system of mammals, he won a Nobel Prize. Medicine, 1904. But by then, he was fascinated by classical conditioning and the way the conditional reflexes were formed and the laws that they created. And he started researching on this topic for 30 so years, until 1936 when he died. He discovered a lot of things with repeated and well annotated experiments, and he really started science that's called behavioral science. This is a true picture of Pavlov and his team, the apparatus he has created, and the dog. What you're going to watch here, it's an enactment, but I want you to see that really the dogs are drooling. These are real dogs, and what you see will be real.
To cause saliva to flow. He rerouted the salivary ducts to the outside of his dog's cheek so that he could collect and measure the spit. Perhaps he thought the production of saliva might be the result of a fixed nervous reflex, like a knee jerk.
Yes, notes. So great that is
After taking many measurements of spittle, he confirmed that the dogs drooled automatically when their tongues touched food.
And that's natural.
He called the response the salivation reflex.
Saliva is needed for the dog to digest the food.
But his work started to run into trouble. As his dogs became familiar with the experimental routine, they started to fill their cheek tubes before Pavlov had a chance to stimulate their tongues. The dogs were learning to anticipate food. Pavlov tried a new technique. He erected screens so that the dogs couldn't see what was going on.
He thought that they see the food.
He introduced introduced a stimulus.
He forgot the smell.
Related to feeding. A ticking metronome.
This is the first time that he's experimenting on salivation associated
Dripped saliva into its cheek tube only when
with a bell.
But after a number of trials, the dog began to connect the ticking with the arrival of meat.
Look, this is a true salivation of the dog.
Made the dog drool.
The salivation of the dog in the film.
Eventually, the dog salivated as much to the ticking itself as it did originally to the presentation of food.
Oh, there. Did you see that? Что я говорил?
He called this new response conditioning reflex. Whatever the stimulus, his dogs could soon be conditioned to produce saliva. Pavlov believed that he had discovered how animals learned, even in the wild.
And that was the truth. So this is the apparatus. I want you to remember that this thing is unethical. The dog was harnessed. Apparatus was not natural. And that was the measurement of the apparatus. And I want you to understand that the tube that carries saliva is not something that the dog would like it, have it in the mouth all the time. Nevertheless, the salivation started. This part of the apparatus that really was put later is not amazing. We know now that dogs smell, but it was something for Pavlov to control the variables. He wanted to control that the dogs were not drooling because they were seeing the food. Let's discuss what was happening before the conditioning and introduce the new terms we're going to use. The natural thing before the conditioning is this. The food, which is the unconditioned stimulus, brings a response, a natural response, salivation. Remember we said why? Food and liquid need to go down the stomach to be digested. So the unconditioned stimulus, which is the food, brings an unconditioned natural response, which is the salivation. Pavlov, before conditioning, check this. He started tuning the fork, made a sound. Is it natural with this sound to have the dog drooling? No. Therefore, this neutral stimulus, the fork, the light, the music box, the metronome, initially they brought no salivation, no conditioned response. But when Pavlov introduced the tuning fork and the food very close to each other, the response initially was the previously unconditioned response, the salivation. At this stage, we don't know if the salivation is a result of smelling the food. We know, though, that the dog is making the association. Sound, food, food, sound. This has to happen a few times to make the connection to this little brain. After that, what we are amazed to watch, dog after dog, animal after animal, is that the tuning fork or the sound, the specific sound that has conditioned the animal, can create salivation. So this is the unconditional stimulus that brings an unconditional response. Second step, neutral stimulus, no response. Third step, unconditional stimulus and neutral stimulus brings unconditional response. Finally, conditioned stimulus brings conditioned response, because this is not normal. This is the conditioning. The key terms we need to learn. The key word is neutral stimulus. It's a stimulus that before conditioning does not naturally bring about the response of interest, in this case, salivation. Neutral response or no response, better for you to say no response, is a response that before conditioning does not associate with the stimulus the object is exposed to. The other key terms. Unconditioned stimulus, UCS, is a stimulus that evolves an unconditional response without previous conditioning. So unconditional stimulus is the food that brings on us an unconditional response, the salivation, the natural one, without previous conditioning. Now, what we consider as unconditional response is the unlearned reaction to an unconditioned stimulus that occurs without previous conditioning. It's really important for you to learn these terms for your exams. You need to be able to tell these terms. If they ask you identify the unconditional response, you have to be able to say this. Unconditional response is the unlearned reaction to an unconditional stimulus. Next one. Conditioned stimulus is a previously neutral stimulus that through repeated pairings with an unconditional stimulus now becomes a conditional response, causes a conditional response. Unconditional stimulus is a stimulus that evolves, as we said before, the unconditional response without previous conditioning. And of course, conditional response is a learned reaction. We discussed that before. Okay, that occurs because of previous repeated pairings. Also, I want you to remember the final ones. Conditioned stimulus is the previous neutral stimulus that causes a conditional response, and conditional response is the learned reaction. So when you are going to be asked to have this scenario identified in exercise, you need to be able to give the terms. We will do it in the class, and we are going to practice on this. This is the most important thing before we go to anything else. Let's finalize the key terms. You need to learn an example of your own to have it handy if they ask you an example, or if they give you a scenario, you need to be able to apply using at least these terms. I want you always to bring your mind into the bell and the dogs, Pavlov's dogs. Neutral stimulus, a stimulus that does not evoke a response. Unconditional stimulus is a stimulus that innately capable of eliciting a response. So that's because of nature capable to bring a response, the saliva. Spider brings me fear. That's innately capable of eliciting a response. Conditioned stimulus is a stimulus that evokes a response because it has been repeatedly paired. See the spider, fear, spider, fear, that's it. Food, sound, saliva, that's it. Could be bell, could be anything. Unconditional response is an innate reflex that is elicited by unconditional stimulus. So it salivates the animal because it needs to digest the food. And conditional response is the learned response, elicited. So I want you to pay attention to this. This elicits or evokes. This is elicited. Okay. I think we have to stop now here because we're going soon to pass to the next topic, which is what the classical conditioning in dog salivating because they hear the sound of a bell has to do with your life. In the next lesson, in the next video, we learn that classical conditioning is the most fundamental way that humans learn most responses, emotions, and attitudes in this life. And this is what Pavlov discovered. Thank you for watching this. Any questions in the class?